When it comes to collecting militaria and surplus, there are a lot of things that are known, but also quite a few that, well, aren't. Oftentimes it boils down to a single piece or element of an item, such as a manufacturer, whether something is legitimate or directly affiliated with a group, period of time, or anything else. Though not all that common, there are instances where a specific item with numerous examples is entirely shrouded in mystery and surrounded by speculation, discussion and debate, variations, alleged histories, and so on. One such example of this that also appears pretty simple and straightforward is a solid green US M1 helmet cover, but don't be fooled as their supposed story is anything but. Before getting to the topic, we have to first thank the sponsor of this video, Venture Surplus. Helmet covers have been around for a while, and the United States is obviously no stranger to them nowadays, and if you're looking to pick up some along with various other helmet accessories and numerous other US surplus and gear, they've got you covered. In this case, quite literally. From M1 to PASGIT and ACH, there's quite a few to choose from, and while there, remember to use the coupon code HISTORY10 at checkout to get 10% off your order. Thanks again, guys. Now let's get to it. The M1 helmet made its debut in June of 1941 as the United States was slowly beginning to realize that the possibility of it being brought into the Second World War was growing more and more likely by the day. Though there were a few instances in the Atlantic, like the Greer incident, the US wouldn't officially enter until after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7th, marking their declaration of war, with Germany and Italy following suit 4 days later. Through the end of the war in 1945, over 22 million M1 helmets were produced, being seen on the heads of service members in every combat theater. Often being painted olive drab with a cork finish under certain conditions, such as them being wet, the helmets had a tendency to shine, which could give away wearers' positions. This naturally led to many creating makeshift covers out of burlap and other materials, while netting from Allied stocks were also sourced before official ones could be made. However, in 1942, the first real cloth helmet cover was created by the Marine Corps that came in the form of a herringbone twill fabric bearing the reversible frogskin camouflage, being issued and used primarily in the Pacific Theater. In addition, secondary covers that also doubled as mosquito netting were also seen, again primarily worn by Marines. Come the 1950s, new uniforms were being developed and slowly introduced by the Army and other branches, all of which remained or reverted back to solid colors, such as khaki and assorted greens. And though experiments and trials had been conducted by the Army during and after the war, no official helmet cover was introduced, while the Marine Corps continued to sporadically use frogskin covers. On June 25, 1950, North Korea launched an invasion of the South, kicking off the Korean War that soon saw 16 countries under the banner of the United Nations land in the South to repulse the KPA, with one of them being the United States. Until July of 1953, North Korean forces, aided by the Soviet Union and reinforced by Chinese troops, fought against UN forces, causing something of a back-and-forth war, eventually leading to a stalemate along the 38th parallel. During this time, nearly 1.8 million US service members were deployed to the country, and naturally quite a number of them saw ground combat. Though seeing new uniforms slowly trickle in, they continued to face the problem with their helmets, leading again to more makeshift covers being created and worn by soldiers, often in the form of converting scrap cloth and materials such as burlap sandbags, extra or damaged fabric from uniforms, and other gear, while the Marine Corps continued to utilize their frogskin covers, with some even being newly produced, seeing April 1953 contract dates. By that time, though, the lines had long since stabilized, resulting in a stalemate, but even as the intensity of combat was dropping, the need to continue to equip and prepare for a prolonged war remained. Throughout the war, monthly command reports specifying just about everything from enemy movements to supply requests were created, with the April one from the 8th Army, or as it was known then, EUSAK, or the 8th United States Army Korea, requested that AFFE, or the Army Forces Far East, the command it fell under, to provide 160,000 camouflage helmet covers and camouflage bands, stating that either nets or cloth covers are desired because it reduces light reflection on the helmet's surface and also muffles sound when the helmet strikes or scrapes brush or other objects. It went on to say the request was justified based on those who had used covers, along with the noted experiences of Marines who had been issued ones too. Finally, it emphasized the need for them by stating, "The urgency of the requirement prohibits extensive research, development, and testing prior to procuring the helmets needed." Or in other words, don't waste time with the conventional method of testing and creating covers, and just send us ones. Now, this is where the story gets a little vague and a bit bizarre. Though the Korean War as we know it ended on July 27th of that year with the signing of the armistice, a peace treaty was never ratified, meaning meaning technically it continues to this day. But even back then, as diplomacy was ongoing, so too was hostilities, even up to almost the point where pen met paper, which pretty much affirmed the call for helmet covers for the 8th, as even though the war was slowly coming to an end, troops would likely continue to be stationed in South Korea along the lines with the North for a while after. Looking again at monthly command reports, the next mention of helmet covers comes in July, which stated that 109,000 of them had been procured and were shipped via the SS Jacob Luckenbach, along with assorted other materials and supplies for the war effort. The problem was the ship only made it about 14 miles, or about 22.5 kilometers, off the coast of San Francisco, California, before it collided with the SS Hawaiian Pilot and sank. Now, this ship was a part of the Luckenbach Steamship Company, which had been owned and operated by the Luckenbach family since 1850, that chartered cargo ships for commercial and wartime means. Apart from the helmet cover connection, this 1953 sinking had a few intriguing coincidences and elements, as both ships were decommissioned World War II-era Bayfield-class attack transports bought by shipping companies after the war. Wasn't the first collision to occur in the area due to fog, as 3 years prior the SS Mary Luckenbach crashed into the hospital ship USS Benevolence, and for decades after, mysterious oil spills plagued nearby waters, which eventually turned out to be coming from a slow leak in the tanks of the Jacob Luckenbach, finally being dealt with in 2002. But back to the covers. The update stated that in addition to the 160,000 requested, an additional 72,000 were asked for to be used as replacement stock as needed, but due to the loss of some 109,000 at sea and hostilities nearly over, the immediate need for them was no longer deemed necessary, saying that replacement of the loss could be effected in 45 days, with an emphasis to initially supply forward units with covers. But it ends with mention of a plan to equip the entire 8th with helmet covers, but also that procurement can be delayed long enough to permit standardization of Army specifications, which is nearing completion. So again, what this likely meant is that they'd try to supply interim covers, but chances were good the 8th would receive them once Army-wide standardized ones were finalized. The August report re-emphasized the need for the initial 160,000 covers, stating termination of fighting in Korea does not eliminate the need for covers, and a replacement issue of 12,000 a month will also be required. The following month, the 8th would finally get their covers, stating a modified Marine Corps helmet cover will be supplied. All but 61,000 of the requested number of camouflage helmet covers are en route. In addition, it seemed they used the opportunity to also trial 5 experimental covers, which looked to have gone up against standard Marine Corps covers as well as modified ones. Sounds like a logistical nightmare, but aside from that, many in the collecting sphere in the decades after point to this interim request that circumvented standard R&D and issuing, as well as the sinking of the Jacob Luckenbach and loss of the covers as a source of these green ones. But before breaking down why, it's important to quickly take a look at one of these covers, as their features and design are significant to the story and this theory. Inspecting the outside, it appears to be just like any other M1 cover, as it has a dual-stitch central seam splitting it in 2 halves, 16 foliage loops. Most versions appear to have perfectly straight slits, though others have been seen with buttonhole ones, that is, with one side ending with a circle, and 6 tongues at the bottom that are placed in between the M1 liner and its shell, securing it. Now, the main thing to look at with these that helps date them to some extent are the tongues, as they are much wider but also shorter. This was the standard with helmet covers of World War II, as well as many Mitchell ones that came after, being altered towards the end of the 1960s. That saw the design refined for easier application and usage, seeing the tongues thinned but also lengthened, while the middle arch was raised up some so as to not get in the way of the chin strap connection points. Many using earlier ones would cut a hole in them to feed them through, as seen by the repair area on this Mitchell cover. In addition, the fabric of it appears to be made of the same material the then recently introduced utility uniforms were made of, that being a cotton sateen. So based on that, we can pretty much lay out what seems to be the main theory and explanation as to what these green covers essentially are. World War II Marine Corps covers didn't really have any stamping, at least as far as ones that stated designations, nomenclature, contracts, stock numbers, and so on that you see with their successors, i.e. some Korean-produced ones, Mitchell, ERDL, and eventually Woodland ones. This eventually changed in 1959 with the introduction of the Mitchell cover, but even those initially had a tag before they switched over to ink stamping, keeping more or less the same formatting. From here we can connect the dots. The 8th Army saw these Marine Corps covers along with assorted makeshift ones and how effective they were, and with very few issue netting being around, as they were mainly a thing seen in Europe rather than the Pacific and Asia during World War II, they requested a cover to be made that would circumvent the standard prolonged development period. The established Marine Corps specifications were looked at and seen as the simplest and quickest solution, and with new uniforms rolling out during that period, the same solid green fabric was used with the first shipment of 109,000 that was lost at sea. Assuming the initial request of 160,000 was approved, that means 51,000 remained. 123,000 if the additional requested 72,000 for use as replacement stocks were created too. The U.S. federal catalog system the military used was initially set up in 1949 and wasn't truly finalized until 1952. And there was still quite a bit of work to be done assigning new stock numbers to new items, as well as ones that had been around for some time. So as to why they weren't stamped or marked, it could have been due to them not being a contracted and/or standardized piece intended to enter the stock system, not to mention the planned switch from ink stamps to a sewn-on tag, which was seen in 1959 dated Mitchell covers. If this was the case and most were lost at sea, any remaining could simply have sat somewhere in a warehouse or something as the war was pretty much over, and focus on covers being sent over there was shifting from combat use to testing and development. It's hard to determine if there was official usage post-1953, as instances of solid-colored covers can be seen in footage in the years and decades after, from Europe to the Americas and even Asia. Most of the time, these can be determined to be makeshift or custom-made due to the design or one or two soldiers wearing them, but other times it's hard to tell due to image quality. However, there are a few examples where they appear to be seen on larger scales and look to fit the bill pretty well. A prime example of this is from the Big Picture episode 352, titled Soldier in Hawaii, which was released in 1956, that goes over the state, at that time still a territory, from a general standpoint while also highlighting its strategic importance in the Pacific, as well as conditions of the 25th Infantry Division stationed and training there. It ends with a segment of a mock war game showcasing a number of soldiers wearing what looks to be the covers as they match the OG-107 utility uniforms they're wearing, have twigs and branches attached at the correct areas where foliage slits would be, and all look pretty uniform between the different wearers. Plus factor in the date and location being right in between California and South Korea, and it's not a long shot to assume some ended up there. So all in all, it sounds like a prime example of Occam's razor. That is, the simplest explanation is often the correct one. Thank you, Brian, for pointing that out. But there are those who could take this theory in and see it as nothing more than this.
I got a paper trail to prove it. Check this out. Take a look at this. Jesus Christ, that right there is the mail. Now let's talk about the mail, can we?
And that's totally warranted. There are still a few unverifiable elements, such as the word camouflaged, which could honestly mean an actual camouflage pattern, as the World War II Marine Corps specification sheet uses that word too, which was referencing their reversible design. And throw in no one actually seeing what those covers were that were lost at sea, and it's still just a theory. But there is also one interesting factor that makes these covers a little more confusing. The fact that some have been encountered with stamping and that they don't connect to the Army, but rather the Marine Corps. Obviously, due to Marine Corps connections such as the references to the reports, using the same design specifications already established, and even the dates of certain frogskin ones falling right around the time of the request by the Army, April 1953, there is a bit of speculation they were actually intended for Marine Corps use. Over the years, a few examples have appeared showing various formatting and dates that appear to span between 1957 and roughly 1967. It was in between these dates that the Mitchell cover began being made and issued. Online, a few discussions have arisen showing comparisons between examples of the green cover, Frogskin, and Mitchell, with some similarities, such as some sharing the same contract and/or stock number, designation, and so on. This naturally leads to a few different theories regarding stamped covers, which boil down to two categories. They're mostly legitimate, or they're mostly not. For the legitimate angle, assuming the covers that were shipped to Korea were these green ones, some of the surviving stock could have been thrown in these batches for whatever reason, using much of the same information as contract specifications can change, i.e. the color and type of camouflage, after they're won by manufacturers. This could have come in the way of a few pieces being found somewhere or produced, then just added to the created lots, or possibly they were some sort of proof of production or trial piece, as during this period slight changes and standardizations were being tweaked and solidified, not to mention the switch in patterns and fabric types. However, the other side of this coin is that they're not legitimate, as a few examples show dates and terms that aren't quite standard and don't really line up, leading to the possibility that they were added after the fact to try and inflate their value on collectors' markets. But it could honestly be a bit of both. However, at the end of the day, there's no real way to confirm it. That leads us to a few other potential theories that are equally as possible, though not as intriguing or mysterious, as they're more or less pretty straightforward. One of the going ones was that they were intentionally not stamped so they could be sold commercially and possibly even exported abroad to nations the United States was supporting during the Cold War. But again, it's hard to say, as though there are examples of them being used by other nations, being as they were so basic in design and sometimes hard to make out in photos, it's anyone's guess. What is known, though, is that green covers were used by South Vietnam during the 1960s, granted on a smaller scale compared to their painted helmets and camouflaged covers, which were often seen in the second design with the longer tongues. Plus, quality on them ranged, and quite a number of ones that are floating around nowadays are more modern reproductions made to look like older or makeshift ones like this, that was found and more than likely produced in the Dan Sin market in Ho Chi Minh City. But whatever the case, the US Army wasn't exactly correct when when it said, according to the 8th Army in Korea's July 1953 command report, that it was nearing completion as it took 6 more years to seemingly get them into soldiers' hands by way of the Mitchell cover, which again was tethered to the Marine Corps initially. This cover, again a reversible camouflage, was the standard for many troops during the Vietnam War, but again, it seems green covers made their way into the country, with supposed examples being seen as early as 1965. However, the same problem confirming these as being the same ones arises, plus the fact that the green side of Mitchell covers could often fade and wear, gaining a more overall green shade which could sometimes be mistaken as a solid color. A pretty popular photo of the 173rd Airborne Regiment in 1965 appears to show 2 soldiers wearing these covers, but looking at different versions of the same photo, you can see that one appears to make them solid green, while the other appears to show shapes of the Mitchell pattern. On top of that, privately tailored and custom garments and items were made throughout the war, plus the aforementioned South Vietnamese covers, and again, it's up in the air. By 1967, though, these covers were officially standardized and began being made in the ERDL camouflage via the updated second version, seeing the longer tongues, though Mitchell covers would continue through the 1970s, but that's a whole different story, seeing so many different variations of the design, plus the short-lived woodland covers before the M1 was replaced with Pasget. Now, you may think that would be it, right? That this all more or less covers, well, the green helmet cover, and yeah, sort of, but not really, as there was technically one other green cover, and interestingly, it has fewer examples floating around nowadays, and much less discourse, but conversely isn't nearly as debated or discussed, though in a way has the same level, if not more vagueness to it. It's the green insect repellent M1 helmet cover. Sometimes confused and mislabeled as sniper veils, the actual helmet cover portion was made of a much thinner and lighter cotton, which included a long mesh section that protected the wearer's head and face down to their arms and is secured via 4 strings. Also mostly unmarked and frequently found in unissued condition, these are not as hotly debated or discussed as they have a connection to another World War II Marine Corps piece, a frogskin insect repellent M1 helmet cover. Photographed throughout World War II, they came in 3 versions which saw minor changes to things like stitchwork, the foliage band, and other small details. The third model is the most commonly encountered, and looking at these 2 side by side, you can see the green version is the exact one. Made in huge numbers during the war, they remained in use for years after, with some even being seen during the Vietnam War. However, the green variation hasn't really been recorded being used all that much, which again makes them something of a mystery, but not to the extent of their standard equivalents. Considering there were evidently so many made, it is also possible a few of the alleged sightings and usages of the regular covers during Vietnam could very well have been these too, as they would have been pretty useful to those within the jungles and more remote locations of the country where mosquitoes were encountered more frequently. But on that note, this seems to be a pretty good point to end this one. Now, with topics like these, there's always a good chance a nugget of information known by someone or hidden away somewhere comes to light as time progresses. A direct reference is found, a photograph or video clip appears, a cover with specific details stamped on it is put up for sale, and so on. So if something does come to light, we'll be sure to make mention of it somehow, some way. If you have a theory or more info, leave it below in the comments. Topics like these are always unique and interesting to talk about, even if they don't have a 100% confirmed and accurate history. A special thanks to Venture Surplus for sponsoring this one, as well as Tongue & Co. for providing info on the Vietnamese-made covers. And hopefully this video covering the mystery of these green M1 covers was interesting and enjoyable, and if so, perhaps leave a like and subscribe if you have yet to do so. If not, no problem whatsoever. Just be sure to check back for more of the history of, or the mystery of, right here on Uniform History.